Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to dive into how Brighton fundamentally flipped traditional football defensive theory entirely on its head. If you follow modern football tactics, you're well aware that the game is constantly evolving. But every once in a while, a system comes along that just completely rewrites the rulebook. Today, we're unpacking a revolutionary approach that proves elite defense doesn't always require, elite athleticism. Actually, it requires something much sharper: positional intelligence. Defense is possession. Former manager Roberto De Zerbi really leaned into this fascinating paradox. He basically treated defensive structure as the actual engine for offensive ball control. The old-school mindset is that you defend to win the ball back, and then you figure out how to attack. But in this model, keeping the ball is literally what prevents the attacks from starting in the first place. The defenders aren't just there to clear the ball. They're progressive playmakers. They are the foundation of the team's entire possession strategy. So that brings up a really interesting question. How exactly do you use zones meant for stopping attacks to actually jumpstart them? Think about a traditional defensive shape for a second. Players basically just occupying spaces purely to block the opponent's path to the goal. Brighton looked at those exact same spaces and saw launch pads. They essentially asked, what if the space we use to block a pass is the exact same space we use to receive one?
Here is our roadmap for today. First, redefining the cover shadow. Second, the inverted fullback structure. Third, escaping the high press. Then we'll look at a clash of tactical systems, dive into the defensive efficiency data, and finally wrap up with vulnerabilities and future evolution.
All right, let's jump right into part one, redefining the cover shadow. Okay, so to really grasp what Brighton does, we have to fundamentally redefine the tools a team has on the pitch. You've got to understand the cover shadow. Typically, a cover shadow is just about cutting off passing lanes, right? A defensive midfielder parks themselves between the defenders and the attackers, and they just block that forward pass. Simple. But Brighton uses what's called a progressive cover shadow. This means the midfielder who takes that space to block an opponent is also perfectly positioned to receive the very next pass from their own center back. That zone is completely owned by Brighton. The player protects the defense, but the second their teammate gets the ball, boom, that player is already standing in open space, ready to turn and attack. The contrast here is just wild when you think about it. Tradition dictates that these zones are purely defensive. You stand there to destroy the opponent's play. But Brighton, they turn those exact same zones into progression launch pads. The same positioning that keeps the opponent out is the exact positioning that moves the ball forward. It's a 2-for-1 deal. One movement, two totally different results. Moving right along to part two, the inverted fullback structure. To actually pull this off on the pitch, you need a highly specific formation, which brings us to the inverted fullbacks. You absolutely cannot execute this with a standard rigid backline. Just look at how Brighton tweaks the standard 4-2-3-1 formation. In a traditional setup, center backs are pure defenders and fullbacks hug the touchline to give you that defensive width. But in Brighton's version, the fullbacks cut inside, they invert, and your center backs suddenly double as your primary playmakers. Even the defensive midfielder's role shifts. Their secondary function is the cover shadow, but their primary job is now progressive play. So by having those left and right backs tuck inside, Brighton is intentionally emptying out the wide areas. Why on earth would they do that? To create completely unpressed inside passing lanes. It absolutely short-circuits the opponent's pressing expectations. When a high-pressing team tries to trap Brighton out on the wing, they suddenly realize, wait, the fullback isn't even there. He's inside. So the center back now has a wide-open pass straight up the middle. And width? They don't lose it. It's just maintained through incredibly quick passing combinations out to the wingers, rather than just having a fullback glued to the sideline. Which brings us to part three, escaping the high press. How does this all actually look when a high-pressing team is breathing down their necks? This is where the magic of that progressive cover shadow really shines. Bypassing the press doesn't take one hopeful, desperate long ball. It takes 4 very deliberate, calculated short passes. First, the goalkeeper plays it out to that inverted fullback who's dropped deep. The fullback immediately bounces it back to the center back. Now, because the pressing team chased that fullback inside, the center back suddenly has an open lane to hit the number 6, who's just waiting perfectly in that progressive cover shadow we talked about. By the time the pressing team even realizes what's happening, the ball is already being pushed forward to the number 8. Just like that, the press is completely broken. A perfect example of this double-duty mentality is the number 6 role, which was brilliantly executed by guys like Alexis McAllister during his time there. He had this amazing rhythm. He constantly scans and pre-positions himself into a defensive cover shadow before the ball even gets anywhere near him. That allows him to receive the pass in a zone his team entirely controls, meaning he can instantly face forward. He's not catching the ball with his back to the opponent's goal, desperately looking for a backward pass. He is already facing the attack, totally ready to thread the needle.
Let's get into part 4, Clash of Tactical Systems.
To really appreciate how good this system is, we need to see what happens when it collides with the absolute best. What happens when patient, progressive defense meets hyper-aggressive pressing? When Brighton plays a team like Liverpool, you get this beautiful clash of tempo. Liverpool is trying to trigger a frantic high press, right? Using aggressive cover shadows deep in Brighton's half, looking for chaos and rapid transition. But Brighton's deep inverted positioning systematically diffuses the whole thing. They just patiently build up, using cover shadows in their own half. Liverpool tries to hit their press triggers, but because Brighton's fullbacks invert, those triggers literally don't even exist anymore. Brighton escapes the pressure and completely dictates the tempo.
And against a possession giant like Manchester City, the contrast is just as stark. City relies heavily on centralized possession. They run everything through one dominant deep player, like Rodri, keeping their fullbacks relatively wide for those direct passes. Brighton, on the other hand, distributes the load. They use sequential passing chains. They don't just rely on one single pivot guy. They rely on a rhythm of positioning between the center backs and the number 6, using those inverted fullbacks to constantly create fresh, short, sequential passing angles.
All right, part 5, the defensive efficiency data. Now, tactical theory is a lot of fun, but as always in this explainer, we want to look at the hard numbers. Does this actually hold up in reality? Well, this stat brilliantly illustrates their dominance, an astounding 78 to 82% possession retention rate while actively under pressure. That is a staggering figure. It absolutely proves that by using anticipatory positioning and creating those unexpected passing lanes through inversion, they aren't just surviving a high press, they are completely neutralizing it. Look at how Brighton's pressure resistance just blows the Premier League average out of the water, sitting right up there with those elite multi-billion-dollar squads. But check out the interceptions per 90 minutes. They maintain an elite-level interception rate between 4.2 and 4.8 entirely because of their positional intelligence. They aren't running themselves into the ground to win the ball back. They're literally just standing in the exact right mathematically advantageous spaces. It's incredibly efficient.
Finally, part 6, Vulnerabilities and Future Evolution.
Okay, no system is perfect, right? So as objective analysts, we've got to look at the cracks in the armor and see where this philosophy goes next. What happens when the system is pushed to its absolute breaking point? Well, when faced with ultra-aggressive pressing from super athletic teams that literally commit all 5 attackers to the press, these cover shadow zones can actually turn into targets. If the opponent just floods the zone, Brighton's buildup can get intercepted dangerously deep. To adapt to that, they're forced to drop their center backs even deeper, taking a much more conservative approach. And they have to rely super heavily on the goalkeeper acting as an expanded sweeper keeper, sometimes stepping 40 to 50 yards off his line just to give those center backs a release valve.
Systems always have to evolve. Looking at the timeline, the transition from De Zerbi to Fabian Hürzeler in the post-2024 era has kept those core principles of the progressive cover shadow alive, but it's injected slightly more aggressive positioning and faster transitions. It's a totally natural evolution, taking that patient, methodical buildup and just adding a bit more transitional venom to catch recovering defenses totally off guard.
So you might be asking, why doesn't every single team just copy this tomorrow? The answer is the immense structural cost. It requires highly technical ball-playing defenders, a deeply sophisticated number 6, and a complete unified system redesigned from the coaching staff all the way down. You can't just plug and play this tactic. You need an entire squad that fundamentally believes positioning will always trump sheer athleticism. And for a lot of traditional clubs, that is a massive, massive cultural shift. Which leaves us with a really crucial question to ponder. As systems like Brighton's consistently prove it calmly passing through cover shadows beats frantically running through them, are we watching the extinction of traditional defensive football? I mean, if defense truly is possession, then the teams that are still treating defending and attacking as 2 completely separate phases, well, they might already be playing a game of the past. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and hey, keep an eye on those passing lanes.